quite camouflaged, and they really are quite camouflaged. At the very top of your screen there, the photo is of a female sage grouse, and on the bottom screen is the slightly larger male sage grouse. And so, earlier in the beginning conversations, we talked about them being on leks, and that's when they're being counted on these leks, on these mating grounds, because that's when they're most visible. I'm guessing most of y'all had a chance to be able to go out onto a lek, which is a phenomenal piece of sagebrush country. They have this incredibly strong fidelity to these leks. There's sometimes you can make a joke if you can park a car on top of a lek and the birds will still come there year after year. They are really, really, really tied. And this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about management. Where is the important habitat for them? Leks are one of these really important habitats. So when the males are the first to arrive on the leks, and they'll fight each other to try and get the attention of the females, they'll strut around with their tails fanned and emitting this drumming sound from their air sacs in their chest, squeezing nearly a gallon of air, and sound can travel for up to 2 miles. So this landscape has been called, which I love this quote, "a forest in exquisite miniature" by Mark Twain. It can be extremely brutal given it's an arid high desert ecosystem. They have harsh winters. Now, amazingly, they're the only ones that I can know of, the only animals that I know of are wildlife that actually increases in weight in the wintertime. And that's because they are so connected to these sagebrush plants. Their winter diet is 99% sagebrush leaves and buds. They use the plants for roosting, cover, and food. However, they are an omnivore. So especially when they're chicks, they'll tend to go more into the riparian areas and get insects. So where do we see sage grouse? What you're looking at is a map of their historic range, and then their current range. They occupy only about 56% of their historic range. Because they were found across so much of the 11 states and 2 Canadian provinces, they really fed the westward migration of peoples. And there's also a really strong connection, a cultural connection to many of the tribes across the plains. And Bernie, if I could have you pop into the chat box that great link. Perfect, you did it on the chicken dance. If you haven't had a chance to take any of the imagery or watch the video, it's a great piece. What you're seeing, the photo in the bottom right-hand corner, I'll give you just a brief little story. There was a conference held in Lander a few years ago. Wyoming Game and Fish Department hosted it, and it was for the various researchers that are working on sage grouse issues. There was a famous sage grouse researcher who passed away. And for one of the field trips, all of us got into these big vans and we went down outside of the town of Lander. We stopped. We're not sure what we're doing. They didn't tell us what was happening. We all kind of shuffle out, waiting to be told what to expect. And all of a sudden, we had some Shoshone dancers come up and crest over the hill. And they had this absolutely breathtaking chicken dance. So again, the culture is rich and strong. Sage grouse are really part of the iconic West, many of which are found, not surprisingly, you all know, here in Wyoming. The numbers range between 37 and 38%. It is, as I said, North America's largest ecosystem, found in 11 states. Now, where they're going to be highest in number is where you're going to tend to see the largest, healthiest swaths of sagebrush country, and where you tend to see fewer people. They don't like activity. They are a very sensitive species, so you do see highest numbers in Wyoming and Montana. So when Audubon has advocated for this bird, we work with the state game and fish agencies because they manage the bird. Whereas federal agencies, we work with them because they are the primary land manager for the habitat. So a lot of what Audubon works on is in regards to public lands, because this makes up a lot of the West and is a really big issue because of the close connection to many of our states' economies, very much in Wyoming, and the West's heritage. As I mentioned, the sagebrush ecosystem forest an exquisite miniature. We have 350 other species of plants and wildlife. many of which are of conservation concern. And even though it's the largest ecosystem in Western North America, it's sad to say, but many kids today could tell you very little bit about the ecosystem. They could actually tell you more about the Amazon rainforest. So what we have done at Audubon is we do not only conservation in regards to advocacy and engaging on policy related decisions, we also do education. So Bernie, if you could put into the chat box, there's a great link to our resource, so educational resources. We created these comic strips that is widely distributed across the state for free to students so they could learn about a great burrowing owl as she explores the sagebrush ecosystem and the wide range of critters she meets out there. And then the second version talks about a migration that she goes on. So again, going back to that ecosystem, we have 18 of these sagebrush species. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. They act as a nurse plant. And the sagebrush there is on that left-hand side. You see that really deep tap root that allows it to survive in these really arid ecosystems. And it also collects the snow and so provides that perfect place and that shelter to support all these other native plants. Sagebrush are really long-lived. Some species can survive 150 years. We're still trying to figure out how to restore sagebrush habitat when it's disturbed or destroyed. I am actually part of a committee that's over on the eastern part of the state trying to figure out how to restore sagebrush habitat, planting seedlings, what to do, what's going to work. We really don't know. What we do know is they don't bounce back easily. So in contrast, we actually know quite a bit about greater sage grouse. It is one of the most well-studied species of conservation concern. If you have a chance to Google that image of the two hens that have those wheels, there is a researcher out of UC Davis, Gail Patricelli, who has done some really ingenious research of taking stuffed sage grouse, putting them on wheels and having them move around the lek on tracks to understand their behavior on these leks. There's all kinds of just really fascinating research. So a lot of this science has helped us to understand, how does this bird respond to its habitat? How does it respond to different threats out there? And admittedly, the map that you're looking at is not pretty, but it captures how challenging this species is to manage. Not only does the species cross state lines and management boundaries, but the threats vary too. So along the western portion, talking Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, there's a lot of red. That's related to an increase in fires, hotter and more frequent fires due to invasive annual grasses. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. In the eastern portion here in Wyoming, in Colorado, the threat has a lot of blue related to it. That's reflecting energy development, where science has consistently shown that sage grouse respond negatively to this form of activity. So we know from the recent science how sage grouse are responding, but it's not because of just this more recent science, and by recent, I'm talking about past 2 decades. We've known for quite a long time that greater sage grouse are not doing well. The photo is from 1806 from the Lewis and Clark expeditions. That is a drawing by William and Clark of a sage grouse. How great is that? But in 1953, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, including as part of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, actually flagged greater sage grouse as a species of conservation concern. So let's jump forward in that century. And between 1999 and 2003, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service received 8 petitions to list greater sage grouse. They did some review, and most recently in 2005, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, after looking at the best available science, said greater sage grouse do not warrant federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. And then this is where it gets interesting. But was that an accurate determination? In 2006, we started to hear some of the first allegations of meddling. A high-ranking DOI official named Julie McDonald in DC, who is trained as an engineer actually, was accused of influencing and determining the outcome of the greater sage grouse listing decision. She personally reversed, changed, removed, and ordered Fish and Wildlife Service to adopt her edits. In fact, there was an inspector general reviewed, Department of Interior Inspector General reviewed it and said, quote, nearly every decision made on the protection of endangered species over 5 years was tainted by Julie McDonald. So in 2007, after this big hubbub, I mean, it's making New York Times, and we're not talking just greater sage grouse. There's, again, over the 5-year period, other species were influenced as well. So Department of Interior, early part of 2007, Inspector General levels charges of misconduct against Ms. McDonald for repeatedly intimidating U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff, editing field findings, including the 2004 grouse analyses. By middle of the year, May 2007, she actually resigns after internal investigations and finds that she has injected herself personally and profoundly in a number of Endangered Species Act decisions. She ultimately resigns 1 week before a House Congressional Oversight Committee hearing. So this just blows it all out of the water, right? Fish and Wildlife Service originally said, no, they don't need to be protected. Then we find that actually it's not a fair and legitimate process. And so the court overturns the Fish and Wildlife Service's finding. Now, Fish and Wildlife Service has to go back to the drawing board. And here enters the state of Wyoming. Governor Friedenthal in 2008 issues an executive order, the very first in a series that ultimately gets upheld by by subsequent governors from both sides of the aisle with revisions. And it is the very first executive order that develops the core area strategy. And this core area strategy identifies key remaining grouse habitat and establishes new conservation measures. Audubon is part of that sage grouse implementation team and has been part of it since the initiation in 2008. It includes a broad suite of stakeholders, and you'll see a photo about that in just a little bit. So, okay, wow, now we have Wyoming. Again, you guys have most of the birds. The Wyoming leadership is taking this seriously. But let's take a step back to the national stage. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wraps up review of the best available science and determines in 2010, yes, greater sage grouse warrant federal protection under the Endangered Species Act for 2 reasons, those that are bolded on your screen. Loss or fragmentation of sagebrush habitat and inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. And those regulatory mechanisms, those protections would be found in federal land use plans or resource management plans, as you may know them as. What's interesting about this is in 2010, Fish and Wildlife Service says, yep, they deserve to be protected. They warrant federal protection, but it's going to be precluded because there are other higher priorities. Well, Fish and Wildlife Service was brought to court because they were sitting on a big pile of species that warranted federal protection, but nothing was being done. They were to this gray area. And in 2011, the court came up with a decision and said, you know what? By September 30th, 2015, you have to make a decision on what to do about greater sage grouse. So that starts off this massive effort. Because, again, we know BLM, there's most of the sage grouse are on BLM lands. BLM lands are across the West. So let's get working there. That was what Fish and Wildlife Service said was one of the main ways that they could be protected. So between 2011 and 2015, federal agencies, both actually the BLM and Forest Service, worked on amending 98 management plans. Each of these management plans, whether it's Forest Service or BLM, usually takes several years to work through. I mean, multiple years. These become the law of the land. It tells you when you can do things, what you can do, when you can't do them. And so this Herculean effort to amend 98 of these over 4 years. The gist of these plans, which encompassed 67 million acres across 10 states, is that not all habitat for sage grouse is equal. It really followed the Wyoming model. And in there, you can see the sage grouse habitat in the map. You have dark gray and light gray. Light gray is general habitat. Dark gray is priority or core habitat. That's where you have more grouse. That's where you have stronger protections. And these federal management plans were based on these habitat designations, and they tried to improve habitat conditions and minimize surface disturbance. So, mentioned Brian Rutledge on the sage-grouse implementation team. Well, he went to DC and brought some of his colleagues from the sage-grouse implementation team. You have a miner, oil and gas developer, a county commissioner coming and speaking to the woman there in the red shirt in the middle, Miss Sally Jewell, who was the Secretary of Interior, and really pushing for the idea that yes, we can find solutions that allow us to still utilize this land and protect the bird. It's science-based, we need assurances, we need certainty. So it was this idea of people coming together, talking around a table that normally don't talk about it, trying to find solutions. There was a lot of collaboration, partnerships. And what was exciting about all this is that all of a sudden we're thinking big scale. We're not doing these random acts of conservation here and there. We're thinking strategically. I will note there was a lot of public support for this throughout this effort, a lot of attention. You had reporters in Maine doing stories about a bird out west that was hard to find, where there's very few people. You had public opinion polls occurring in rural areas, in urban areas, and there was public support for it. At the time, my boyfriend, Leo, also even did some social media talking about the need to protect greater sage grouse. So it was a good time. And in all of this positivity, all these huge efforts to create these federal management plans that took into account science and had some protections outlined where you're minimizing disturbance in the most important habitats. These big efforts at the state level, at the federal level, ultimately resulted in the Fish and Wildlife Service, per their court requirement, making a decision by September of 2015 saying the bird does not warrant federal protection. Here on a stage is Brian Rutledge. He's standing there with 4 Western governors, both sides of the aisle, 4 agency leadership. You're talking federal agency leadership. You're talking Department of Ag. You're talking U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You have a rancher on your far right. It really was a moment to celebrate the ability to come together and solve problems. With every new presidency comes new policies. Under the Trump administration, one of the policies, one of the largest policies, there was a series of them that most affected sage grouse, was an executive order that was signed in 2017, promoting energy independence and economic growth. It is often referred to as an energy dominance agenda. And what this executive order ended up doing is saying, instead of multiple use on public lands, energy development becomes the most important use on public lands. And he required a review of regulations and suspending, revising, or rescinding those that burden or hamper the development of domestic energy resources. So at that point, we started to see this disregard for science, those protections that we worked so hard for, that we, the collective we, worked so hard for to develop, that were passed in 2015. Those went out the window, new plans came in, weakened protection. You saw this dramatic increase in oil and gas leasing in sage grouse habitat. Meanwhile, you're also seeing a decline in sage grouse populations across the range. To give you an idea of how energy development started happening much more purposefully within sage grouse habitat are these 2 sort of pie charts, if you will. On your left-hand side is between October 2015 and January 2017. The purple represents the percentage of oil and gas acres leased in priority or core habitat, the most important grouse habitat. So of all the acres leased, 7% of it for oil and gas development was happening in priority or core habitat. Now take a look at that second side of that figure. Between 2017 and 2019, that number jumps to almost 30%. So we see a dramatic increase of millions of acres and thousands of drilling permits approved in sage-grouse habitat. Again, new presidency, we start to see new policies. What's interesting is the Biden administration has used executive actions early on. And the graph on the very bottom, which comes from CNN, shows the different presidents and how the number of executive actions that are used in their early weeks of their position. And you'll see quite a few of them are related to environment. So now you have new presidency. You also have new leadership of the agencies, also very, very common. We have a new Secretary of Interior. This role is incredibly important in that this individual ends up overseeing about 11 different federal agencies, one of which is the Bureau of Land Management. We have 2 women now in leadership roles. At the director level, we have Tracy Stone Manning, who was just confirmed in the Senate. She used to work for the National Wildlife Federation. I have known her for years. We've worked quite a bit on sage-grouse issues. She is very, very knowledgeable. We also have a former Audubon employee, Nada Culver, who was elevated to the deputy director position. She is extremely well respected amongst the broad suite of stakeholders, whether you are an oil and gas developer, whether you're a rancher, whether you're a recreationist. She's also a lawyer by training, so she is truly phenomenal. So it's an interesting time that we're now in. And what's happening in this interesting time? Well, just this year, all these activities are happening specifically related to sage-grouse. And if it's related to sage-grouse, it's related to a lot of sagebrush habitat, of which there is a lot of in Wyoming. So super relevant to you all. In January of 2021, the oil and gas auctions were suspended on federal lands. And as you all were aware of, it got a lot of attention as to what does that mean. In March, announcing reviewing oil and gas leasing programs. Audubon is extremely supportive of that. We do believe oil and gas development is going to continue on public lands, but we want it to be done fairly. It is an outdated program that needs serious revisions to it. So that review is in progress. In April of this year, there was a secretarial order that revoked a series of previous executive orders, including that energy dominance agenda. So if you remember, going back again, January, suspending oil and gas auctions, which happened quarterly across the West. In August, there was a court decision in Louisiana that required the Department of Interior to initiate oil and gas leases again. They couldn't pause them anymore. And so the Department of Interior, BLM, announced, we're going to go ahead and start lease sales in 7 states, including, and that's going to happen in the first quarter of 2022. And they announced across those 7 states, almost 750,000 acres to be leased. Now, once land is leased, the developer has the right, that becomes the primary right to develop on that land, and they hold it for 10 years. If during that 10-year window, again, that is a primary use of that land, if they start developing within 10 years, they own rights for in perpetuity. You can also lease for as little as $2 per acre. That's the lowest bid. So there's a whole series of ways the program can be improved. A couple of stats worth knowing: 90% of federal public lands are available to oil and gas development, and 36 million acres of these are currently leased. Yet only 35% of those are under production. So there's a lot of land out there that's already leased that can be developed. So when Audubon worked with partners to develop comments to the Wyoming oil and gas lease sale that's proposed to happen the first part of this year, we found out that there were 492 parcels, 589,000 acres. 589,000 acres out of the 740,000 acres for 7 states. So Wyoming had the, by far, bulk of the oil and gas lease sales of any of the 7 states. 92% of the parcels were in greater sage-grouse habitat for Wyoming. Now, not only were they in greater sage-grouse habitat in Wyoming, but they were also in core habitat, the most important habitat. So as you look at that map, it's that graph on your far right, shows you those red areas are where the proposed parcels for oil and gas leasing are. And in dark orange is the most important habitat. Our argument for this lease sale was to hold off on this lease sale, which the BLM has the right to do until the review of the federal oil and gas lease program is completed. And that every effort should be made to locate the oil and gas lease sales outside of grouse habitat, especially priority habitat. And why is that? Well, we have a plethora of new science that came out literally just this year. There was a massive report put together by a team of 94 scientists and specialists from 34 federal and state agencies, universities, and NGOs, including Audubon. And this team contributed to a comprehensive assessment of the sagebrush ecosystem. Now, this plan just lays, or this report lays the foundation for what is the current status and the health of that ecosystem. It's not doing well, but it goes into the detail that we hadn't had before, and it's the latest, greatest that we have. We are expecting part 2 that will actually give us some guidance on recommendations on how to improve the health of the ecosystem, expected likely next year. Not only do we have information about the habitat, but we also now have a range-wide analysis of how the bird is doing. Range-wide means across the entire range of the bird. So the U.S. Geological Survey, which is the research arm of the federal government, worked with each of the state game and fish agencies, including Wyoming, and collected the data and took a look at how the bird is doing across the range. What you have here takes into account the entire range and the birds and the mean peak males per lek. Going from 1965 to 2019, we're seeing an average annual decline of 3%, way more than we had expected. What that tells us is actually an 80% decline in greater sage-grouse since 1965. Going a step further, we know how we talk not all habitat is equal. Well, the threat to the leks are not equal. We found, per that research by the USGS, and it is being published, and went through a rigorous peer review process within USGS, those leks on the periphery, and what you see in that map are showing those leks in their different colors. The darker the color predicts that they're more likely to be extirpated. We also learned about taking a look at the long-term situation. What's the probability of extirpation for these leks? And if you look at, let's take a look at that bottom line, that bottom bullet there, 78% of leks are predicted to have a greater than 50% chance of probability of extirpation in the next 56 years. So the numbers are startling. We know grouse are not doing well. We know over the long term, their chances of extirpation is extremely high, not equal everywhere. And we know the habitat's not doing well. And I knew that there would be questions in this crowd on okay, so that's across the range. How about Wyoming? Well, 2021 lek counts, which it sounds like some of you all have been part of, which is awesome. I was able to do some of the lek counts when I lived in Laramie for a while. It was awesome. So what are we looking at for 2021? Across the state, these lek counts found that there are approximately 16,000 males. Now, these numbers that you're looking at are based on 85% of known occupied leks being observed. So keep that in, it's not 100%, it's 85, which is pretty darn good. Based on these counts, there was an average of 16.9 male sage grouse per active lek. So that is right here, 2021. What's concerning about that is the numbers are going down, down, and down. In fact, we're looking at just in the past year, a 13% decline. This isn't necessarily a bad thing because they are cyclical, but we're seeing a steady decline in our state that has one of the largest and healthiest populations. Now, when we talk about reproductive and population growth, Wyoming Game and Fish has estimated that an average of 1.1 chicks are born per hen in 2020. And they say for populations to actually grow, we need to be closer to 1.5 chicks per hen. So again, we're looking at all these different parameters, trying to understand how are our sage grouse doing. They're not doing well. What you're seeing in Jackson Hole is also concerning. Your grouse population are isolated. They're genetically distinct. The numbers have really been stagnant. My understanding is populations there are still hovering at the lowest count on record. Heard that some areas only had 40 known males actually in the valley. There's been conversations and discussions about translocations, which has been a dicey topic. So yeah, lots of interest and concern about what's happening in greater sage grouse. Now, when we think about greater sage grouse, and we talked about, okay, what does the bird need? We know the bird needs good habitat. We knew there was a bunch of science. Those 2015 plans, the best we'd ever seen at that point came about in 2015. And then they were weakened in 2019. And then most recently, the court overturned it. So FYI, we're now back to those 2015 plans. Those are now the resource management plans that rule the land. However, when those 2015 plans were developed, we didn't have this problem to deal with. It was not fully considered in those resource management plans, and that's cheatgrass. Cheatgrass, as many of you are aware of, is an invasive plant. It spreads really quickly, provides great fuel for fire, and once that fire comes up, it kills the sagebrush plant, which is the dominant feature of the ecosystem. Once that cheatgrass gets started, it starts to create this fire cycle. And while fire has been part of the sagebrush ecosystem, it didn't occur until except for every 50 to 100 years. We are now seeing cheatgrass causing fires in the sagebrush ecosystem every 5 to 10 years. So they are hotter and faster than we've ever seen them before. Research has found that just 1% of cheatgrass on the landscape doubles the risk of wildfires. It is truly insane. So there's a lot going on in Wyoming, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. But what's interesting is it's not just in Wyoming, but the Western Governors Association recently compiled a list of the top 25 terrestrial invasive plant species in the West. 8 of the 25 species grow in sagebrush ecosystem, and cheatgrass is listed as number 2 overall. It is incredibly aggressive. What do you mean by aggressive? What are we talking about? I like numbers. I like trying to understand what's happening out there. On your right-hand side of your screen, or these columns show acres of greater sage-grouse habitat burned in that given year. On the left-hand side is the different owner, land manager. Are we talking Bureau of Land Management? Are we talking National Park Service, private lands, state lands, other federal lands? What I'd like to draw your attention to are these numbers circled. In 2016, about 500,000 acres were burned in sage grouse habitat. Just 2 years later, and again, at this point, this hadn't been evaluated in the 2015 plans. Just 2 years later, we're looking at over 2 million acres burned of greater sage grouse habitat. This is an incredibly important issue to deal with. So we have fire as a major threat to sagebrush lands because of that invasive grass fire cycle, right? And we really see this in these ecosystems that are warmer, drier, less resistant, less resilient once they do become invaded. And what you have are these sagebrush biologically rich sagebrush habitat being transferred and turning into these monocultures of invasive annual grasses like cheatgrass. If I could have you put in the chat box, Bernie, there's some videos, and one of the things that I wanted to share is, a lot of folks, unlike yourselves, are in really big urban areas where you can't access the sagebrush ecosystem. And so we created some videos to try and help people understand who don't live there, how important this ecosystem is and what is happening to it. This map here captures sagebrush communities in the green, and the red shows you, oh, the links don't show up. I wonder if we could maybe follow up with folks, Bernie, with some links to the videos. It looks like it's just showing the text. But in red are the fires in sagebrush country. They are dramatic. But we're not talking just cheatgrass. We're also talking ventonata, medusa head, red brome, bufflegrass, and lemon lovegrass. So there's a lot of threats out there. I will give extreme kudos to your very own Teton County Weed and Pest District. They have been extremely proactive within the state and taking on a regional profile in the efforts to do education and outreach to ensure that we minimize the effects and the spread of these invasive annual grasses. There is a campaign called Play Clean Go that I would super duper encourage you to all look into. Play Clean Go. Again, it has been sponsored partly by Teton County Weed and Pest, because this is a way that recreationists can make sure that we don't spread these invasive annual grasses as we are out there enjoying these landscapes. Interestingly enough, cheatgrass is not listed as a Wyoming state designated noxious weed. However, it is listed in Teton County, and it's listed in approximately 10 of the Wyoming counties. So there's lots of information out there. I encourage you to learn more about it. What we're really needing is large scale control of invasive annual grasses. We need funding for that, and we need to understand how to better rehabilitate and restore this habitat. And most importantly, before we disturb and destroy some of the best habitat, some of the best and most pristine habitat, including Golden Triangle, which is a wonderful chunk of country that supports some of the highest density of greater sage-grouse, some of the lowest oil and gas potential, yet was still leased. We need to protect some of the best habitat we have because we are having a really hard time restoring them. So in all of this, you all hear lots of information from lots of presenters. What I would like to encourage you and hopefully motivate you is that each of you carry a lot of influence. While I'm honored to be here tonight and be able to share a little bit about the background and the depth of the challenges and the depth of the successes and what we're still facing, ultimately, people want to hear from people they know, whether it's family, friends. So people are 2 times more likely to learn when they hear information from family, friends, and others they know. Not only are they more likely to learn, they're 10 times more likely to act. So what has been shared in the chat box, the learning component are these short little 4-minute videos to educate yourself about what's happening in the sagebrush ecosystem and sharing it with folks. If you have a Nextdoor, share it over Nextdoor. If you have a social media page, share it that way. If you communicate with loved ones by email, please share it. And secondly, take a look at that action alert. We are encouraging members to support sagebrush habitat and restoration. We need funding. Please take part in that action alert and share it with others. One of the things that I can't emphasize enough is if people don't know about an issue, they can't care about an issue, and they can't engage in the issue. So with that, it is 5 minutes before the top of the hour. I know I went through a lot, but would this be a good point, Bernie, to kind of wrap it up and then have some conversations and answer some questions?
Yeah, Dahlia, I think this is exactly the right point to do that. So I think if you, because I can't see everybody, but hang on a minute.
Would it be helpful if I didn't share my screen so we could all look at each other again? Would that be good?
Yeah, why don't you do that, Dahlia, if you would?
All right.
Oh, that's better. So Jeff is asking, can you comment on the impacts of renewable energy projects and the drought on birds and habitat?
Yes. It's a tough one. I think all the extreme weather conditions that are hitting us now, that we are personally feeling, whether it's smoke in the air or whatnot, you're hearing on the news these extreme weather conditions happening on the coasts. It is becoming part of everyday life, and it's affecting us health-wise and economic-wise. It is, we're getting to a place of being able to admit that climate change is here. And so we need to find solutions. And one of those is renewable energy development. One of the reasons renewable energy development is great is also diversifies our economy, right? We're not relying on just one point. However, I am frustrated when people tout it as green energy, that it doesn't have impacts. It most definitely has impacts, and you must take into account that where development is occurring. There are some places where you have such high density and high value wildlife resources, for example, that it's not appropriate to have energy development of any form, including renewable energy development. And there are other places where it is completely appropriate and should occur. And so from Audubon's perspective, we do comment not only, as you all saw, on the oil and gas leasing sale and in the efforts to review the oil and gas leasing program, but we're also involved in renewable energy development. We're actually, and I can pass along to Bernie that you're more than welcome to share with folks, we're going to be hosting a presentation on solar development. We're seeing a big uptick in energy development across our public lands across the West. So it is here to stay. How do we engage effectively on it? Drought and birds. Part of the climate change, right? What's happening with the dry conditions? We already live in an arid, high elevation environment. Then you add drought onto it, which makes restoration of disturbed habitat even harder. So we have a lot of tough challenges in front of us. And I think having an informed and aware public that encourages our elected officials to be informed and aware is really important.
Dali, Arn Johansson is asking, what mix of plants makes up a healthy sagebrush habitat?
Ooh.
I'm gonna go get Francis, Arn. Be careful.
Right. I can show you. That is not my area of expertise. I can get you all some more information on that. I'd also be happy to open it up to other expertise on the call. Is there anybody?
Anybody want to comment on that?
Ron,
I'll try and get some information.
Surdam is trying to talk, but you're muted. Ron, you have to take your mute off.
Go.
There you go, Ron.
Now,
Right. Now, what was the question?
did you have anything to add?
Well, we have to take care of the planet. And it turns out that sagebrush environments are just as important as a place where you can produce oil and gas. I mean, we've got our priorities all messed up, and we basically have to start making sure that every element of the environment is taken care of, and that we don't like this policy that we heard about tonight, where the President Trump's executive order about everything on public land. The number one priority is developing energy. Well, I mean, that's insane, because you'll eliminate the sage grouse, you'll eliminate everything else that lives out there in the sagebrush habitat. So we just have to be smarter, and we have to educate people, and we have to get our federal agencies and state agencies to manage the environment, and not sort of prioritize and say, this is the number one priority, so we're just going to do that. We need to manage it so that the whole environment stays healthy. I don't know whether that helps or not, but it's I'm continually discouraged when we try things like the core area, and that whole concept was developed to prevent the sage grouse from becoming a member of the endangered species, and it was a great idea, but in about 6 months, people were already drilling in and around those core areas. So I mean, you not only have to have good policy, but it has to be enforced.
I put in the chat box a couple links. One of the federal agencies that has put millions and continues to be active is the NRCS, and the ability to work directly with landowners. And there's a link there that I included that talks about the plants. And then also the second link is refers to the a close-up of the poster. So if you want to actually see some of the visuals of some of those plants, and I had that in my presentation, but there's a link directly to that poster. Ooh, excellent. Thank you. There's a great, Peyton just put in a great resource. Oh, fabulous. I didn't know about this one. Excellent. Thank you. And this is a 2017, from Wyoming SWAPS, the State Wildlife Action Plan. Great. Thank you.
I'm going to put a link in to Audubon Rockies, and I encourage everybody to have a look. And because we actually do have Audubon chapters in eastern Wyoming, but I don't believe we've got any in central, and I'm sure we don't have any in western. But Audubon is an organization that we really should be cooperating on bird conservation in Wyoming, and not just on sage grouse, but on a lot of other issues. And I'm very pleased and thankful to Dally for being willing to share her expertise with us. She's well known on these issues, and she does a lot of great work on the legislative end that a lot of us don't have the temperament for. Let's just put it that way. Does anybody have any other questions for Dally? Because otherwise we will wrap it up. Well, I want to, Kay? What's up?
I put a question in there really early. I thought you had a fascinating chart that talked about the male count and how it has, I guess I would say it has risen and fallen. So I was wondering if you've been able to figure out any correlation or any attributes or reasoning as to why there would be increases in counts, and if that's something we can address. I think I don't have the chart in front of me, but there were like 3 peaks in which the male counts went up. Yes.
Yeah. So those, they're all, think of those as being similar to, say, jackrabbits too. They do the up and down peak. Folks are still trying to understand what those peaks are. They are cyclical. And so when you look at how greater sage grouse are doing, there's a lot of caution to not say, don't just look at 1 year to the next, look at the larger picture. And let me see if I can share my screen and we can look at that together, because I think that's one of those visuals. Hold on, let's see. That is better served looking at that together. Hold on. There. Okay, let's see if I can't share screen now. Can you see my screen? Or no, not yet.
I can't. You should still have sharing privileges.
Okay, let's see. Share. Here we go. Let's try this one. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is that's the screen you're talking about, right? And
we've got a black screen for you, Dally. There you go.
Oh, okay. Is that it
Yes.
here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So you have that up and down that you're talking about. More important, let's take a look at this one. Again, you see that peak and then this naders at the bottom, right? The naders being the lowest at that trough there.
Mhm.
The takeaway is this general decline across the entire time frame, right? So not just looking at it, say, from 2013 to 2019, but looking back to 1965 and that general decline.
Yes, my question is, do we know what helps with the peaks? Certainly, yeah, we end up finding that with, I guess, about any species, but I guess it would be advantageous to understand
We're still trying to figure that out.
Ah.
What peaks we believe there are, because they're so tied to habitat, is how the habitat is doing. There's research going on right now. Could drought be affecting conditions of the habitat and therefore survival of the bird? Fire peaks, and if there's been a high fire year, believed to have some impact on bird numbers. So a lot of it is habitat related for sure.
Okay.
And what's really cool, yeah, you bet. What's really cool about greater sage grouse is because they are so tied to the habitat, you have the ability to work with a wide range of people who realize the broader benefits, whether it's the Mule Deer Foundation who care about mule deer, but they see the direct benefit to having good habitat for mule deer, whether you're talking about ranching community, if the ranching community is fighting tooth and nail against cheatgrass, if we can have healthy habitat for cattle, you're going to have healthy habitat for birds. So what's good for the bird is good for the herd. You may have heard some of that saying before. So yeah.
I hope to have at some point, maybe next year, a program on Audubon's conservation ranching initiative, which I'm involved in working through Montana Audubon. And it's a really interesting program. I think it's going to be very important in ranch land west for not only conserving birds, but for helping conservation-minded ranchers economically. And that's important if we, particularly if we want to save lands that haven't been put under the plow yet, that haven't been sod busted, and save native grasses and native bird species on them and native insect species. We need to be able to support conservation-minded ranchers, and this Audubon Conservation Ranch Initiative is a pretty good program in my estimation. Dally, I'd like to thank you again.
I just have one quick question, I think.
Beverly,
Dally.
I've been waiting for this.
No, you weren't. Dally, it seems a couple of years ago, there was consideration of a serious defunding of the Institute of Biodiversity at the university. And I'm wondering, did they get defunded? Are they still up and going? And they just seem like such an important department or whatever it was.
I remember that. That was a big hit They do a lot of research, a lot of education, a lot of outreach. They're still around.
Yeah.
Audubon has partnered with them for many years on doing a BioBlitz. By the way, if you guys haven't participated in a BioBlitz, it's tons of fun. It goes to a new location around the state every year, and you camp out and you do this intensive survey of all the critters you can find there. Tons and tons of fun. But they have been involved in BioBlitz every year. So they're still around. I don't know how, honestly, it's been impacted on their day-to-day operations.
Yeah.
Beverly, I'm putting the link to the Wyoming Biodiversity Institute website in the chat room. And
Okay.
it may give you some insight into what's going on. They are still operating. I'm in touch with them on a couple of things, but they have, like a lot of the programs that we might care about at UW, they have suffered from funding reductions.
And I had a very quick question for Ron, if he doesn't mind. Ron, in case people don't know, is a tremendously strong conservationist and worked with Wyoming Outdoor Council for a long time. But he also was the Wyoming state geologist. So my question is, do you have any insight or any optimism for Wyoming and how things are going?
Well, you have to stay optimistic. But, it's really discouraging how we're sort of one-dimensional in terms of the economy. In the fact that, just like with the Biodiversity Institute and the Geology Department and the things that have been really helpful to our interests are not supported like they should be supported.
Yeah.
Like now they're going to put the Geology Department in petroleum engineering.
Crazy.
I mean,
Oh, wow.
it's that part is very discouraging. And the having served on all of these the Oil and Gas Conservation Committee and all the rest, it's the state's long-term welfare. We have to diversify, and we have to take care of what we have here in Wyoming, and that is we have public lands like no other state hardly in the nation, and yet it's just one-dimensional, and that is we've got to maximize the profit on that. State lands, I mean, they're directed to do things that make money off the state lands. And unfortunately, preserving things like sage grouse and in the minds of some don't look at that as profitable or something that's going to make money. But it's interesting because now we're seeing all these people flocking out of the cities trying to get back into open spaces. And if you live in Teton County, I mean, you witness this almost every day. And somehow the state has to come to grips with this revenue thing and get out of this coal, oil, and gas thing and make money in other ways. And I came here in 1966, and the first thing people said to me when I got to the University of Wyoming was, we have to diversify the economy. And here we are 55 years later, and we never diversified the
I
economy.
want to add something when you're done.
So I'm optimistic that somehow people are going to come to their senses. But it's still, and I'm encouraged by things like this cooperation between the Audubon Society and part of the ranching community, because the ranchers and their their attitude towards public lands, and I'm generalizing now, is pretty one-dimensional. And I,
Yeah.
it's just, I think that if, in the long run, if the ranchers ought to form a coalition with the Audubon Society, because really a lot of their interests are in parallel. But we just need to have more conversation and come to some better compromises, and not be so, divided. And I think we can survive, but it's been 55 years and I haven't seen much progress.
I want to add something. Beverly, this is Joy. I'm Ron's partner in crime. And,
Yes.
and I think a great resource that we have in Wyoming is reflected like in the people who are participating in this conversation tonight. So I just want us to maybe think about what Margaret Mead said, and it's a famous quote. And I think this speaks to everything you guys are working on and we're all trying to achieve together. And she says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So keep up the good work, guys, and don't get discouraged.
I love
Thank
that
you,
quote.
Joy.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
think that's probably a good note to wrap it up on. Thanks, everybody. It's great to have you all on, and one of these days we're going to be able to do a live meeting and a hybrid, because I know a lot of people really like to do the Zoom. Ron, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you on this.
Thank you. And keep up the good work.
Well, we're going to try. Arn, I'm going to try and get you an answer for your question about soil types. So see what we can do. So Dally, the question was, why are leks where they are? Is there a soil type involved? That might be a better question for Ron.
You know,
Well, isn't there the joke, Ron, of if you want to know what oil and gas is, just find a sage grouse? So, again, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that part of it is based on the open space, right? That it provides not a lot of sagebrush, which you think that allows the males to get there and perform their dance and be visible to the females, and also for it to be windswept, so it doesn't allow the vegetation to grow and it remains open.
I'd like to second that. Years ago, I was training bird dogs over on the Valentine refuge for sharp-tail and prairie chickens.
Yeah.
And we would do the census for them. The bird dogs would point and we would then flush the birds and count them. And one of the things was the leks, and looking where the leks are. And it was very interesting with another species of grouse, of course not. And that was that they really did require open space. It had to be absolute, almost barren, but with the regular habitat around it. And our census work over there on the Valentine Refuge showed that about, I don't know, a very large percentage of the nesting took place between 1 or 2 miles of the lek. So the lek, not just important for the dancing and the breeding and so forth, but it's also important in terms of the proximity of the nesting.
Mm-hmm. So when they're in thinking about protections of sage grouse and the science that we have, there are buffers around leks to try and minimize disturbance, knowing, just as Ron said, many of those birds nest within several miles of the lek.
And the other thing that's really important is that, and we were able to show this like with hailstorms and things like that, it just would destroy the grouse population. And there wouldn't be any grouse in those areas or if you graze cattle, or you know, if there was some kind of construction going on and there was a lot of disturbance, the grouse just left. They disappeared. So they can't be disturbed during that dancing and breeding and nesting part of their cycle.
There's a lot of good information on the biology of sage grouse, including Dennis, answer to your question about predators at sagegrouseinitiative.com. sagegrouseinitiative.com. And there's a lot of good information on there. And I would recommend you have a look at it. And join us next month for ferruginous hawks, which may or may not be predators on sage grouse. I kind of have a feeling they might be. So we're going to go from ferruginous hawk food to tonight to ferruginous hawks themselves. Thanks very much, everybody, and stay safe, and we'll see you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Dally.
You betcha.